Greetings and welcome to Contemplatio. My name is Antti, recording this in Helsinki, Finland. I had a huge pleasure of interviewing Dr. Alexandre Christoyannopoulos, who works as a reader in politics and international relations in the University of Loughborough and as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Pacifism and Nonviolence, published by Brill, among other things. However, this time around I wanted mainly to discuss with him the topic of Christian anarchism, which is something he has been researching for years, as the clearly anarchistic or even communistic, if using modern terms, roots of Christianity are, in my opinion, not discussed enough. I hope you enjoyed the interview. Hello Alex, and welcome to the channel.
Hi Antti. Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
How has your day been so far?
Fine. Busy. Our teaching starts next week, so there's lots of preparation, and it's more that sort of theme these days than research. But yeah, fine. Part of the job.
You have an academic background in at least economics, international relations, politics and government, as well as theology. Did I miss anything crucial, and what can you tell me of your life in academia so far?
You didn't miss anything crucial. I guess one thing to perhaps emphasize is that the last 10, 15, maybe 20 years, it's really primarily politics and international relations, and that's my title. That's where I work, with an interest in religious studies, theology, an interest in economics, although that was really in earlier days. Probably more of I don't know if I'm a jack of all trades, but I'm interested in lots of different disciplinary angles on different things, but technically sit more in politics and international relations. And no, that's right. I feel quite privileged to be able to research and teach about the kinds of topics I have long found interesting. And yeah, that's my life in academia so far. It's not easy for everyone, but I've been lucky enough to find a corner that works. So yeah.
I first became aware of your work because of the term Christian anarchism. Do you remember when you first became interested in anarchistic thought, and have you ever considered or currently consider yourself to be a Christian or an anarchist?
Yeah, I get these questions, so fair enough. I mean, anarchism, it's really embarrassing. I can't easily trace a single moment when I became interested in it. It came gradually, I think, in my university years, through friends, through, I suppose, having interests that were always likely to lead me to anarchism, kind of unease with various forms of domination and hierarchy, etc. I mean, I suppose I had a predisposition that was going to make me compatible with it, given the right entourage, and I guess that materialized. When I started the PhD, I was going to do it on something a bit broader than just anarchism, but looking at kind of structures in religion and in politics and the overlap of those. But to cut a long story short, that got condensed and rearranged, and then around then I fell upon Tolstoy, and I can't remember kind of what came first, but I remember once I picked up Tolstoy, getting quite thrilled and finding it really exciting and interesting, and noticing that very little had been written, at least in English, about the political and religious writings of Leo Tolstoy in the last 30 years. And so that was quickly I suppose the route into anarchism that became the dense main route for me, the kind of Tolstoyan Christian anarchist approach into it. Although by now I'm familiar with many other branches and find that interesting too. So I guess, yeah, in terms of anarchism, it probably resonated with a lot of my skepticisms about the world at the time, and still does, and so I kind of gradually became interested again through friends and some research, I suppose. Am I an anarchist? I guess so, in many ways. Certainly in my in the way I read the international political economy and how it functions, etc. I mean, perhaps my activism could be a little bit more spiky, a little bit more frequent. I mean, I am active in some ways, but I'm also busy at work and with a family, etc. So I'm aware that, you know, I'm gentrified as well, and I'm comfortable enough. I'm not an anarchist from, you know, from the, you know, the hardest hit parts of society, particularly, and so yeah, that would be, I suppose, my anarchism. But yes, yeah, I think I'm certainly more an anarchist than many other things, although probably a pacifist too, which is an interesting debate we can have. I'm interested in pacifism. I think there's all sorts of interesting compatibilities and tensions. In fact, that's a paper I'm working on at the moment. Am I a Christian? I don't know. Probably not. I don't know if I ever was. I wasn't really raised as one, if I'm really honest. But then there are Christians to whom I say that, and they come back to me and say that that's not true. You are at least as Christian as some other people in my flock, they might say. You know, they might be priests and so on. And now, I suppose if I am a Christian, I'd be more of a, I don't know, a philosophical or Tolstoyan one. I'm interested in Jesus' ethics. But then let me be quite radical and suggest that most of the people who are classified and classify themselves as Christians today are not, and they probably are no more Christian than I am, to put it generously, because of the kind of Christianity that they subscribe to. And so, you know, I don't think most Christians follow Christ in the way he seems to have asked quite clearly the people who wanted to follow him to do. So, yeah, that's the way I'll leave that question, I suppose.
One thing most Christians probably don't want to think too much about is the apparent anarchistic and, shall we say, even communistic message and way of life of the early Christian communities and possibly Jesus, Yeshua himself. Do you think it's reflected more in the Gospels or the letters of Paul?
It's an interesting one because I think different Christian anarchists will give you slightly different answers. You know, you'll have some like Tolstoy who don't have much time at all for Paul. You know, they derive their Christian anarchism from the Gospels and from the example and teaching of Jesus. You have others who kind of push back on that. Now, I think, you know, the priority has to be the Gospel in that it is the core of the teaching and example of Yeshua, Jesus. Especially the Sermon on the Mount. It's what a lot of Christian anarchists consider central to their politics, I suppose, to their activism, to their way of relating to one another. So, you know, turning the other cheek, but also giving the second, walking the second mile, giving the cloak, you know, forgiving, not swearing oaths of allegiance, trying to love your enemy, whatever that means. And then you have all sorts of other passages. The third temptation in the desert, which is really about idolatry, I suppose. You have Jesus's arrest and his reaction to that, all the way to his crucifixion. You have all the stuff about forgiving 77 times, etc. There's a lot of content, if you want, in the Gospels on sort of love and forgiveness and how that's a different kind of community, different kind of relating to one another, which I think is one main theme in Christian anarchism. And I've been saying in interviews like these since I wrote the PhD and then book, maybe what I didn't play up as much as on reflection I could have done is how maybe the second in those writings is how maybe the second most important theme after, you know, love and forgiveness in a kind of radical kind way, the second theme would be around idolatry, which I've just mentioned, because it is a federating theme for a lot of Christian anarchists, how the state is a form of idolatry and it's a form of, you know, entrusting the state, a human political structure, with expectations that, you know, by one reading should be assigned to God, as it were, rather than to human institutions. So there's a lot of that in the Gospel. Now, there are Christian anarchists who I'll sympathize with, who would point out that Paul actually interprets that, doesn't depart from it, as people might claim. And so Romans 13 isn't a radical departure from it, but actually an interpretation of it. It isn't about submitting to the state out of idolatry, actually. It is about submitting to human institutions out of love and forgiveness. If you read 12 and 13 together, that would be one classic line, which I elaborate in what I've written on it, citing others. So there is an argument that Paul certainly isn't new, and that he isn't a radical departure, but an interpretation, that his epistles are in many ways interpreting the message of the Gospels. But I suppose the priority would be the Gospels, and that's what certainly all Christian anarchists agree on or prioritize, as it were.
While these tendencies are obviously a problem to the attitudes and political views of many modern Christians, do you think people have started to realize these tendencies more and more as time and research into these matters has progressed?
It's a hard question to answer because it's I haven't been around for the centuries that I would need to measure, and I don't know how to measure this. I don't know whether people are more and more interested in it. What strikes me is that there are always people, or there often have been, as far as we can tell, people who have realized these tendencies to quote you in your question, and but sort of radical, if that's the word, offshoots of Christianity are not a new phenomenon. I mean, for one, you have the early Christians who were quite radical to begin with, before Constantine, but not just Constantine, the gradual institutionalization and capturing of the radical church by the institutions of the time, and then flipping on its head of what it kind of was about, I suppose. And then certainly with the Reformation, you have all sorts of offshoots, and you can start before the traditional date of the Reformation with, the Reformation in Bohemia, as it were, Peter Helsinki, etc. I think we're looking 1400s. And then, of course, later, once Luther comes up, loads of other offshoots, and in Orthodoxy as well. Basically, people who read and understand, for some reason, the message of the Gospels and think, oh, hello, that's not what you're doing. This is radical stuff. I like that. We should try that. That's what he said, the man you call God. That's the way we should go. And so the church has been very good at putting a lid on it as best it could. And maybe especially through the main period of the Middle Ages, let's say Constantine to Luther, it's been quite good at keeping that lid on the whole. But certainly before and after, if not during, there have been all sorts of offshoots. And as I said, the beauty is the canonized text that has reached us about the man who is described as Jesus or the man God who's described as Jesus in it, which, whether there has been a historical Jesus or not, whether there were apocryphal, whether there are other stories that are more accurate or not, the bit that actually made it through, the editing by the councils of important people who decided to frame it in a way that was compatible for the empire, even that is still pretty radical if you read and understand it, if it's not preached in a language you don't understand. And so whenever that's been read, there have been people who have said, well, hello, that's different. Is it more and more so? I mean, we might come to that, but there's also a lot of Christianity, in quotation marks, that's problematic, and that seems to be quite vibrant, supporting Trump, for example. Sorry, I mentioned him. I mean, it's clearly problematic. So I don't know which way the trends are going. But what I can see, if I look at the whole history, as it were, of Christianity, is there have been, dominant mainstream messages that have tried to keep a lid on the more revolutionary stuff, but this kind of stuff has also escaped again and again. More now, I don't know, maybe.
One person of great interest to me as well you have researched is Count Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy, one of the most prolific among the so-called Christian anarchists. When and how do you think Leo Tolstoy became an anarchist during his lifetime?
I mean, that one is fairly easy to answer, in that, at least the way Tolstoy describes it himself, there's a clear conversion moment. There are his biographers who argue the conversion wasn't as abrupt as he claims, but in the 1870s, he goes through an existential crisis, which is increasingly acute, and he only resolves it in his own mind anyway, when he basically settles on a reading of the Sermon on the Mount, and especially on turning the other cheek, which changes, as he claims it, his outlook on basically everything to do with politics and religion. Now that, he plays up the break. There are the biographers who point out there are continuities, but certainly, so for example, his dislike of authorities isn't completely new at the time. His experiments with morality, with pedagogy, there have been examples of that prior to 1879. But it's really only after that he becomes explicitly convinced of what I think you can describe, and I do in my work on him, as his pacifism, his commitment to non-violence, in fact, to no violence whatsoever, to no compromise with violence, his anarchism in his bitter critique of the state, his anti-clericalism, his asceticism, his vegetarianism, etc. And it's only really after that, not only that he's committed to those, but that he actively writes about them in a kind of preaching style, which he didn't really do prior to that. So there is really a break around then, late 1870s, which then leads you to the last 30 years of his life up to 1910, when he's kind of, Tolstoy is a kind of Christian anarchist. And later on, the Soviet version of the life of Tolstoy, which became adopted and has spread since beyond the Soviet world, is that, great patriotic writer of beautiful fiction and depictor of the canvas of Russian society during the Napoleonic War, an important figure in our history for that. But the latter stuff is just kind of, an old man getting a bit nuts. Don't pay attention to that. That's clearly nonsense and naive. Well, that's the one I'm interested in. And there clearly is a bit of a break, certainly in his writing, I think.
As he was clearly fascinated by and in favor of the core message of Christianity, as coming across in, for example, the Sermon on the Mount, he became disillusioned in the organized religion of his time and area. But do you think he got the core message of the probable historical Jesus right?
My impression is that he did. That during his time, the mainstream doctored in all sorts of ways, just as they still are today, to tame some of the more radical elements. But if you read the original, his reading is, I don't know, it seems to me more accurate than you sometimes get in some of the mainstream kind of interpretations. So I think that, my impression. But then, I'm not someone who's spent decades studying these texts. I spent a bit of time, I should certainly, but is that he probably got the reading right, just as quite a few others have done, and that's the reading that survived canonization, as I mentioned before. Jesus was a rebel. He was crucified as such. The cross, the crucifixion, was a punishment reserved by the Roman Empire for political subversives. That's how they read his impact, as a political rebellious one. Now, what's particularly interesting is that he did so only by preaching love and forgiveness and kind of, almost indifference to the state, or to the political institutions of the day. But that's precisely what's subversive about it, and that's what Tolstoy and others have argued, and I think they're quite right. And the history of well, no, I don't want to overdo it, but a lot of the history of the church and its work and its theology and its rituals, if you follow Tolstoy anyway, is basically the story of trying to that muzzle the things and not pay attention to the radical Jesus. So I think, my reading is that he was quite he's got quite a good reading of it, especially given that not as much of the scholarship as we have now was available to him at the time.
Kropotkin himself seems to trace the birth of anarchistic thought in Europe to early Anabaptist communities. Have you looked into this yourself?
So I haven't looked at that closely. I mean, two of my colleagues, Matt Adams, have worked on Kropotkin than me. Now, the argument certainly is plausible, but I wonder if it still would hold today. Like, there's a fair bits of, enough pockets of anarchist studies that would probably argue slightly differently, that kind of anti-authoritarian streak, thought, practice, a kind of a momentum against, an impulse against forms of domination is something that you can find a long history for before the Anabaptists, and not just in Europe. And so if you're looking at those kinds of tendencies, and maybe tendencies for, to use that word, democratic empowerment. I mean, democracy is a complicated word in this territory, but bottom-up organization, consensus type decision making. I don't know. I mean, you find elements of that not just in Anabaptism on, but before and elsewhere, as I say. And I suspect that's what. So, for example, the scholars who are trying to broaden the colonial heritage of anarchism would point out that it's not just a Western phenomenon with roots, say, in Anabaptism. So I think that kind of argument by Kropotkin would probably get a bit of pushback by some of these scholars today. Now, but that there is that anarchism may have played, that anabaptism may have played an important role and had an anarchistic streak, I certainly wouldn't dispute. I just don't know whether that's kind of the beginning of it.
The practice and philosophy of nonviolence in politics and in life in general is something you are interested in as well. Would you say the historical Jesus was likely preaching nonviolence after the previous rebellions had failed in the worst ways? Or do you think he might also have had some not so pacifistic zealot tendencies, as some scholars have suggested?
I haven't studied the zealots closely enough, and I'm sure that the zealots are more interesting and complex than they're often made to be. And so maybe that makes them a bit closer to the way I would read Jesus, as it were. But I'm suspicious of the scholarship that wants to see in Jesus someone willing to compromise with violence. So the way I read it is the kind of action that Jesus exemplifies, and therefore by extension, the kind of actions that he presumably kind of expects or authorizes, if that's the right word, from his followers, ranges between, if you will, the kind of extreme of turning the other cheek at one end and overturning the tables in the temple at the other. Now, I probably don't need to expand on the turning of the other cheek, the element of love and forgiveness, but I would add that this is quite subversive in interesting ways, and for that, there's plenty people can read up if they're interested, or I can elaborate. But I mean, yeah, but so that's the non-violent bit, and that's easy enough, I think. How violent is the overturning of the tables? And by the way, there's very little else that you can point to justify violence. I mean, having knives when he's being arrested or something. It takes a bit of a stretch to look at the few other really passing passages and try and argue that this is a call for violence. The overturning of the tables is not just in one gospel. There's only in one of the gospels, though, that the scene refers to cattle being in the temple. And that's the only gospel that also has Jesus hold a whip. So Jesus turns up in the temple, which is supposed to be a house of prayers, to quote him, but instead sees, to quote him, a den of thieves, people who are, trading and conducting all sorts of activity of dubious morality in a place that's supposed to be a sacred place of worship. Excuse me. So he's upset. He doesn't let that go, and in that sense, yes, Jesus's politics wouldn't just be about letting back and letting crap happen, as it were, things you disagree with. There's a stance to be taken. He takes a stance. He overturns the table. I don't think that turning a table is particularly violent. He might have done it with theatrical visibility, but that's not violence in the sense of physical violence against other human beings. And if you're going to say then, but the whip, then my reply will be, I mean, my and that of other Christian anarchists, the whip is only mentioned in the one gospel that's got the cattle, I forget the cattle and the sheep, which the whip is used to drive away. So there is no reference in the text to human beings being whipped. There is no physical violence against other human beings. Now, if that's the extreme in terms of militancy, that's the extreme in terms of militancy in the example of Jesus and in what that would sort of enable. So you're looking at a spectrum of actions between turning the other cheek in a way that's kind of subversive because kind of ridiculing the request, etc. at one end. So again, not completely passive. And at the other, yes, taking a stance and non-violently taking part in what you might call non-violent direct action. That's not violence. Now, I don't know whether zealots sit with respect to that. And yes, in his context, the zealots were around, but his stance seems to be, the traditional understanding is, rather different from the zealots, as well as, by the way, from the Essenes, who are completely withdrawing. So it's a different kind of activism than the one typically understood as zealot. But it is not violent. It is active. It is a form of direct action, but it is not violent, by my reading. And again, certainly if you talk about violence as violence, physical violence, physical I'm losing my words, physical damage, physically hurting other human beings, there's none of that in there. So that's the extent of it.
Your book, Christian Anarchism, is of course a must read for all interested in this topic, but what can you tell us of your current and future projects, such as the Journal of Pacifism and Nonviolence?
When I finished my book on Tolstoy, I found myself having done a lot of what I wanted to do on both Christian anarchism, religion and anarchism, and on Tolstoy. I mean, there's a fair bit out there, a book on each, various chapters and articles, etc. Many of which I try and make freely available online, if because I don't like the university paywall. And so at that point, I was thinking, what do I want to do next to some extent? And in a way, my research has kind of broadened to an interest in anarcho-pacifism and applying an anarcho-pacifist lens to different kind of themes and problems in politics and society. So of course it's building on Tolstoy and Christian anarchism, but it's without necessarily, still using the religious lens in, as it were, but trying to elaborate it in a more vernacular and, I don't know, secular language, I suppose. So I'm interested in anarchism, pacifism, anarcho-pacifist critiques. And yes, a big chunk of my time these days is taken by this Journal of Pacifism and Nonviolence, which we launched earlier this year. You can imagine it involves a fair bit of work, but it's quite interesting and exciting. And that's partly trying to, I suppose, give further credibility and respectability to the emerging, I think, but vibrant field of pacifism and nonviolent studies, to call it that. And so, we're just trying to do that. And by the way, that doesn't necessarily mean that I've stopped being interested in, religion, for example. So to give you one example, one special issue that's forthcoming, that's in the pipeline of the journal, is on Islam and pacifism and nonviolence. And we're open to perspectives that look at Christianity again, of course, just as any others. So that the religion is just one of the themes we're interested in. We're interested in for the journal, not the only one, but absolutely still interested in that. So these days, that's what I'm working on: anarchism, pacifism, anarcho-pacifism, and the Journal of Pacifism and Nonviolence.
Okay, Alex, thank you very much for this interview.
Perfect. And thank you very much for having me. Pleasure to talk.